Dr. Beatrice Golomb has a background in engineering, biology, and medicine, and is professor of medicine at the University of California, San Diego. Her research is on cellular energetics and oxidative stress. Welcome, Dr. Golomb.
Diplomats, mystery illness, and pulsed radiofrequency microwave radiation. Many of you may have heard or read about the mystery illness affecting U.S. and Canadian diplomats in Cuba and China, in which strange noises were perceived, and this was accompanied or followed by myriad symptoms encompassing things like sleep problems, tinnitus, headaches, cognitive loss, etc. A bit of a preamble about electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation, or EMR, travels in waves, and these are characterized by their frequency, the number of cycles that pass a point per second, which is measured in cycles per second or hertz. Because all electromagnetic radiation, regardless of the frequency, travels at the same speed, the speed of light or c, the frequency is inversely proportional to the wavelength. For the more cycles to pass a point per second requires that those cycles be shorter in wavelength. So higher frequencies are proportionally tied to higher energy by the equation E equals h nu, where nu is the frequency and h is Planck's constant. This means higher frequencies have higher energy, and for energies that are high enough, for frequencies that are high enough, this energy suffices to dislodge an electron from an atom or molecule, a process called ionization. And so higher frequencies of radiation from the upper part of the ultraviolet range on up are referred to as ionizing, and lower frequencies of radiation, including radiofrequency microwave radiation, are referred to as non-ionizing. But just because radiation is ionizing does not mean that ionization is how it causes health effects. And indeed, most of the evidence for harms from ionizing radiation, as also from non-ionizing, involves oxidative stress, that kind of free radical injury that antioxidants help to protect against. And you can see from this upward going arrow, where the higher end of the arrow is higher frequencies, that we arbitrarily divide radiation frequencies into different bands that we give names to, like extremely low frequency radiation, like power line radiation, or radio frequency infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma ray radiation. The focus on this talk will be on radio frequency radiation, or RF, and microwave radiation, or MW. And radio frequency radiation encompasses a broad band of frequencies from 3,000 cycles per second to 300 billion cycles per second, that is to say from 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz. And microwave radiation is the upper end of this radio frequency range from 300 megahertz to 300 gigahertz, or 300 million cycles per second to 300 billion cycles per second. So we mentioned that frequency is inversely proportional to wavelength. Higher frequency means smaller wavelength, and so these radio frequency range corresponds to a broad wavelength range all the way from 100 kilometers to 1 millimeter, and the microwave part of this is from 1 meter down to 1 millimeter. So we mentioned that diplomats heard strange noises, and it's important to mention that sound is not the same thing as radiation. I've found that some people are confused by this because perhaps because both are waves and both are measured in cycles per second or hertz. And we use both in medical imaging. We use ultrasound and also radiation. But these are different kinds of waves. Radiation comprises transverse waves, in which the direction of variation is perpendicular to the direction of travel, while sound, which are pressure waves, comprise longitudinal waves, in which the direction of variation is in the direction of travel. Also, they travel at very different speeds. The speed of light versus the speed of sound is basically the speed of thunder versus the speed of lightning. But in selected settings, radiation can produce the perception of sound. The term sound is a bit confusing because we use it both to refer to the stimulus, the sound wave or pressure wave, and also to refer to the perception of sound, whether or not it is produced by sound waves. But again, in selected settings, radiation can produce the perception of sound, a phenomenon that is called the Frey effect. It's also variously called the microwave auditory effect, radio frequency hearing, microwave hearing. This occurs only with pulsed radio frequency radiation and within the frequency range of about 2.4 to 10,000 megahertz, or 2.4 to 10,000 million cycles per second. The leading theory about how this occurs is the thermoelastic theory, according to which these pulsed radio frequency radiation sets up minuscule elevations in temperature on the order of a millionth of a degree, and these in turn set up pressure waves, which are then sensed by the cochlea and processed thereafter just as if they were regular noise. So these sound like they're real-world sounds to the auditor. But the good news is that there are differences between the characteristics of RF-induced sound and sound wave-induced sound, and we can compare characteristics of the noises reported by diplomats to the features expected for sounds produced by these different kinds of stimulus. So different sounds were reported by different diplomats. There's no reason why this would be expected if these were sound waves, but this is expected for radio frequency radiation because the same pulse radiation produces different perception of sounds in different individuals, since the sounds that are perceived depend not just on pulse characteristics, but also on head dimensions. The reported character of the sounds by diplomats encompassed clicking, hissing, chirping, clanging, and grinding. There's no reason why it would be these sounds if this were induced by pressure waves, but it is exactly these sounds that would be expected if it were RF induced, because the Frey effect produces a characteristic, shall we say, spectrum or stereotype spectrum of potential sounds encompassing exactly these. Sounds were reported to have been heard virtually exclusively at night in settings of very low ambient noise, and there's no reason why this would be the case if these were sound waves, which can be heard also in settings of some level of ambient noise. But there is a reason this would be expected for RF-induced Frey effect, which can only be heard in settings of very low ambient noise. It was reported that there was laser-like localization of the sound in space, which was reported to, quote, defy known physics. Well, this may defy the physics of sound waves or pressure waves, but it certainly does not defy the physics of electromagnetic radiation. Indeed, lasers are electromagnetic radiation. So some diplomats were reported to move a few feet away and the sound abruptly stopped. They moved back and the sound returned. Or in another instance, a diplomat heard the sound and someone else in the, quote, immediate vicinity, unquote, heard nothing. So again, if you're outside the path of radiation, you would no longer be able to hear the sound. But if you move within the path of radiation, you do continue to hear the sound. And it was reported by diplomats that the noise source seemed to follow them as they moved within the territory in which the sound was heard. This would not be expected for sound waves. In fact, we have in our brain the so-called superior olivary nuclei, which help us to localize the origin of a sound in space. But it is expected for RF-induced sound because this is produced inside the head. It is typically perceived as coming from just behind the head, or for some people just above the head or inside the head. But wherever it is perceived for that person, this is independent of their position and orientation relative to the source of radiation, and therefore the sound seems to follow them as they move. 5 of the Cuba diplomats each independently reported that if they cover their ears or cover their head, the intensity of the noise did not seem to attenuate. This is contrary to expectation with sound waves, but is expected for RF-induced Frey effect. Indeed, covering the ears can even intensify the perceived intensity of the sound by further blocking ambient noise. So each of these 6 characteristics are expectations and predictions of radio frequency radiation. None are expected or predicted for sound, and several are frankly incompatible with it. Indeed, our RF-induced noise is really the only thing that fits the 6 specific features of noise that were reported by these diplomats. And so this alone essentially compels the conclusion that pulsed radio frequency microwave radiation was in the vicinity of diplomats at the time these noises were heard. So it was reported by the Associated Press that noises were recorded that would be which would be incompatible with the Frey effect. These cannot be recorded because they're produced inside the head. But we can compare the characteristics of the recorded noises to those occurring in the episodes that led to health problems. And we see that the recorded noises were not tied to health effects. Different sounds were not reported by different diplomats or auditors. These were not occurring only at night in settings of very low ambient noise. They were not reported to have laser-like localization in space or to follow people as they moved within the area in which they were heard, and nor were they reported to attenuate when people covered their ears. What was reported was that all the recordings sounded similar to one another, and locals in the area who heard the sounds in company with diplomats said they sounded like crickets that were abundant in the area, and indeed spectral analysis found that they matched the sounds produced by Caribbean crickets. Well, it's true that RF can produce chirping that can sound like crickets chirping, but unfortunately so can crickets chirping, and there's nothing about having heard the Frey effect that prevents people from subsequently hearing and recording crickets chirping. So this, in fact, in no way provides testimony against the RF hypothesis. So the first pillar of the argument that RF microwave radiation must have been responsible for diplomats' experiences is the characteristics of the noises, which again are only a fit with this. But the second pillar are the quantitative as well as qualitative profile of symptoms that were reported by diplomats. And we can compare symptoms, the fraction of diplomats that reported different symptoms to the fraction of those with non-ionizing radiation toxicity reporting the same symptoms. Now, when people experience non-ionizing radiation toxicity at lower levels of radiation than cause problems in others, we refer to these people as electrosensitive. So we can compare rates of symptoms reported by Swanson for the Cuban diplomats to those reported by Cato and Johansson for electrosensitive people, incidentally reported before the diplomats, so it can't be influenced by them. And for all the symptoms that were elicited in common in the two studies, we see that there's very close quantitative as well as qualitative concordance. Headache, 81%, 81%. Cognitive problems, 81%, 81%. Sleep problems, 86%, 76%. Dizziness, 62, 64. Tinnitus, 57, 63. Irritability, 67, 56. Anxiety, 57, 55. So there isn't any other known exposure or condition that produces these symptoms in this quantitative profile. So this again essentially compels electromagnetic radiation as the cause of these symptoms. There are many other exposures and conditions that can cause each of these symptoms, virtually anything that can cause mitochondrial impairment and oxidative stress. So many of the conditions that my lab studies, like statin or fluoroquinolone side effects, pesticide side effects, go for illness, but again, not in this profile. Each has its own distinctive profile, and particularly sleep problems and auditory symptoms like tinnitus are distinctively elevated with non-ionizing radiation toxicity and also in diplomats. And this is perhaps because of effects of radiation on melatonin and also the fact that the entry point for radiation into the head is through the skull, and there is no skull barrier at the point of the ear. So in addition to the noises being only compatible with this and the symptoms being only compatible with this, the potentially objectively measurable signs are a fit as well. So we don't have good data that provide quantitative information elicited in comparable ways on any of these objective signs, but we do have reports in both diplomats and in those with non-ionizing radiation toxicity that tell us that subsets of individuals in each group experience hearing loss, vision problems, speech and balance problems, nosebleed. Some were reported in each case to have had brain swelling. White matter injury was reported in both cases. In each case, published studies reported that brain imaging looked like traumatic brain injury or TBI. And in both of these cases, it was independently commented that some had past head injury, which incidentally might be a risk factor for developing these problems, whereas others had not. So the signs are also a fit to radiofrequency radiation. Next slide. So in addition to the noises, the symptoms, and the signs, there's also precedent in terms of past exposure to U.S. diplomats to microwaves in a foreign embassy setting, specifically those stationed in Moscow were microwaved from the 1950s through the latter 1980s or 1990s. The end date depends on the source. There has been conjecture that this was surveillance or perhaps weaponry, intentional harm. Russia's claim was that it was not surveillance, but jamming of air surveillance devices on top of the embassy. But in fact, it was known that microwave-activated surveillance devices had been identified in the ambassador's office during Ambassador Avril Harriman's tenure, and then also during the tenure of Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson. Reportedly, what were thought to have been microwave-activated listening devices fell through a roof following heavy rain. Nonetheless, staff were not told that they were being microwaved until then Ambassador Walter Stossel threatened to resign unless they were told. Incidentally, Ambassador Stossel subsequently died of leukemia, a cancer type that has been tied to radiofrequency radiation. And one of the other authors in the list of references below, the third Shoemaker, also developed leukemia following being stationed in Moscow. So this hypothesis was very strong long before there was any evidence that high levels of RF had been measured. It seemed peculiar that people had not set out to document whether there was radiofrequency radiation, but in fact, evidence has recently been made public that one of the Foreign Services personnel did secure a radiofrequency meter and did conduct testing. And a Guangzhou diplomat filed a U.S. Department of Labor Workers' compensation application, which is unclassified. And New York Times and others have recently reported, on the findings, which I've known about for perhaps a year, of a commercial off-the-shelf or COTS trifield 100XE meter that was secured by a Foreign Services personnel family member. And they photographed the readings, which were above the top available point on the scale of 1 milliwatt per centimeter squared. And so this level of radiation exceeds safety limits worldwide and is in excess of 100-fold the upper reported limit for sustained exposure in China. So in addition to everything else, we now have evidence that high radio frequency was documented to have been present in the vicinity of Foreign Service personnel at the time they were experiencing these noises and health problems. What might have been the source of the radio frequency radiation? Well, again, the chief candidates now, as was the case in Moscow, are surveillance or weaponry. Surveillance includes so-called TTW or through-the-wall surveillance, which you can read about in reports from the National Institute of Justice or the ACLU. This can detect movements as fine as movements of breathing and can also be involved in auditory surveillance via so-called Weiher type surveillance processes. And this is just what's available in the non-classified literature. Microwave weaponry has been in development for some decades and is also a leading candidate. And some features of some of these episodes may suggest weaponry over surveillance as a candidate. Of course, dual purpose cannot be excluded either. And then, of course, in civilians, we have development of these symptoms from devices with supposed innocent intent, communication devices, but for a range of reasons, these are unlikely to have been responsible for the episodes for the diplomats, the U.S. Foreign Services personnel. So this slide simply shows that an illustration that microwave weapons have long been in development, and it was already in the open unclassified literature by this Brenderman citation in 1999, that what was already former Soviet Union microwave weapon system, in this case for anti-aircraft purposes, were in development, just reinforcing that microwave weapons are available and have been in development for decades. So what might have been the mechanism of injury? Well, the best evidence implicates oxidative stress and its downstream mechanisms. The evidence that radio frequency radiation causes oxidative stress is abundant, heavily replicated, and powerfully triangulated. By replication, we refer to the setting in which different studies involve the same exposure and the same outcome and produce similar results. And by triangulation, we refer to the setting in which a problem is approached from different angles, producing converging findings. So Yakimenko provides an excellent example of replication in which 100 studies were identified that each asked the question of whether low-intensity radio frequency radiation produced oxidative stress, and 93 of the 100 studies found that it did. The remainder of these studies refer to triangulation. For example, DeLuca examined whether people with electrosensitivity, those who get non-ionizing radiation toxicity at lower levels of radiation than others, were more likely to have gene variants that confer impaired defense against oxidative stress. And indeed, those with electrosensitivity were significantly more likely to have these variants of genes that adversely affect oxidative stress defense, a finding that really can only be explained if oxidative stress is a mediator for the injury. Belpame examined over 600 electrosensitive people in France and evaluated a range of different biological markers, each of which, although this is not mentioned by Belpame, are downstream markers of oxidative stress. And each of these were found to be adversely altered in minority subsets of those with electrosensitivity, but the one reportedly consistent findings was depressed levels of melatonin gauged by the ratio of the chief urinary metabolite of melatonin to urine creatinine. So melatonin, people think of as for sleep, and it is important for sleep, and indeed, as we mentioned, a major problem that is often the number one problem in studies of electrosensitivity, as it was in Diplomats, are sleep problems, which are affected by melatonin. But melatonin is also a critically important antioxidant. And indeed, in the next slide, we'll discuss that briefly. More broadly, antioxidants in general have been found to protect against radiation injury across the electromagnetic spectrum, again, further implicating oxidative stress as a mechanism of this injury. This is true for ionizing as well as non-ionizing radiation. And for non-ionizing radiation, like radiofrequency radiation, whether or not it quote, exceeds thermal limits, whether or not it causes heating of the whole organism sufficient to account for health problems. The term thermal is used differently in setting versus setting, but the typical definition of thermal injury is that the heating has to be sufficient to explain the problems that arise. So multiple studies, of which this is a tiny subset, literally scores of studies, showed that melatonin protects against radiation injury, really for frequencies across the electromagnetic spectrum. And here we show just an example of a few studies that report that melatonin protects against radiofrequency/microwave radiation. And also there are a number of studies showing that that non-ionizing radiation, including both extremely low frequency radiation and also radiofrequency microwave radiation, can variably depress levels of melatonin. And we'll talk about how variable effects on antioxidants are a more general process. So downstream mechanisms of oxidative stress include those shown here. We've mentioned that DeLuca et al. Found that there are gene variants that affect the degree of oxidative stress with a given level of stimulus such as radiation. And this is one of a number of biological factors that affect how much oxidative stress is produced by a given level of radiation. And in turn, there are genetic and other factors that then influence the degree to which oxidative stress is translated to each of the range of downstream mechanisms, which are variably operationalized in different affected individuals, and by the way, have their own different distinct time courses to onset and recovery. So we expect that we will multiply the variability going from RF to oxidative stress by the variability going from oxidative stress to the downstream mechanism in determining how much RF produces the downstream effect, and this would be expected to lead to more variability in studies looking at RF versus downstream mechanisms, and in fact, that's what we see. But nonetheless, each of these effects as downstream effects, not just of oxidative stress, but of RFR, have been replicated. So examples include, on the left, impaired mitochondrial function from RF, alterations in voltage-gated ion channels, including but not limited to calcium channels, increases in inflammation, increases in autoantibodies, and it should be mentioned that oxidative stress modifies substances in the body in a fashion that makes them more vulnerable to autoimmune attack. The Golomb study found that around 20% of electrosensitive individuals had antibodies to omyelin. I predict that if you looked at other antibodies, you would find elevations in a bigger range than just these. On the right, we see that there's also alterations in membrane structure and function. Oxidative stress causes endothelial dysfunction, which leads to impairments in blood flow. And in fact, studies including that by Golomb have shown alterations in blood flow to the brain, increases in apoptosis or triggered cell death, which in turn contributes to increases in inflammation, and alterations in blood-brain barrier. And indeed, there are also studies documenting that electrosensitive people, a subgroup, have elevated markers related to blood-brain barrier impairment. So each of these downstream mechanisms then in turn contribute to health effects associated with oxidative stress, health effects that have variable impact in different individuals because of different engagement of these different mechanisms and different time course to onset and recovery. It should be mentioned that even more apparently inconsistent is literature of the impact of radiofrequency radiation on antioxidant defenses. A number of studies find that antioxidant defenses go up. A number of studies find that antioxidant defenses go down. But we see this with each pro-oxidant exposure that is looked at. They can produce bidirectional effects on antioxidant defenses. Essentially, if you have a comparatively low intensity oxidative stressor, then a number of people, those who are able, will actually adaptively upregulate their antioxidant defenses in response to this. But those whose antioxidant defenses are already overwhelmed, or who for some other reason cannot further upregulate their antioxidant defenses, will simply have antioxidants further consumed and depleted, and this will lead to a reduction in antioxidant levels. So both increases and decreases in antioxidants are seen. This is not really inconsistency. This is perhaps it could be said to be an expected inconsistency in findings. And I should mention that in part because of this, depending on time course of examination and what you look at, in fact, it's the case that radiofrequency radiation can, in principle, lead to increases or depressions in oxidative stress, and this can contribute to variability in findings for these downstream markers. So of particular interest to me is mitochondrial injury. It's the focus of some of the work that we do in our lab. And mitochondrial injury may be a cause as well as a consequence of oxidative stress with radiofrequency radiation. So this is findings from a study by Zalyubovskaya, declassified by the CIA in 2012, that looked at biological effects of millimeter wave radiation. So millimeter waves are the upper frequency end of the microwave range. Remember that microwaves go from 1 meter in wavelength down to a millimeter. And this is of interest even though millimeter waves cannot have been responsible for the Frey effect. So they could have been included in the exposures of diplomats, but they can't have been responsible for that part of the exposure. And there's no particular reason to think that they necessarily were included. But data on millimeter wave radiation is particularly important to encompass in discussing mitochondrial effects, because the claim has been that millimeter waves, because of a very short wavelength, could at most affect the skin, or conceivably, and most people exclude even this, the nerves and the peripheral blood vessels in the skin. But in fact, data show otherwise. So this study exposed rats for just 15 minutes a day for 60 days to millimeter wave radiation. And it was found that not only were skin and nerves and blood affected, but also bone marrow was affected. There was increased blood vessel permeability. And mitochondrial problems were identified in organs throughout the body, including the brain and heart, two heavily energy-demanding mitochondrially dependent organs, as well as liver, kidney, and spleen. Of note, rats showed wide variability in how affected they were, just as we see in humans. And increased duration of exposure appeared to be associated with increases in problems, which also converges with human literature, such as the study by Sachikova and Glotova in the Soviet Union, which found that those who had developed microwave illness from occupational exposure, for those who were at least moderately affected, returning them to the place where they were re-exposed led to a course that was progressive. So that Sachikova-Glotova study was translated among a series of Russian reports in 1974 by Gordon, and I listed this among the set of otherwise U.S. government reports, just to illustrate that the idea that radiofrequency radiation, this non-ionizing radiation, can cause toxicity, including at low intensities. So the idea that radiofrequency radiation can cause toxicity is far from new and is not a fringe idea. It is well reflected in U.S. government reports dating back at least to 1931. And this is a tiny fraction of U.S. government reports, by the way, that support this. By 1971, Glaser had issued the first of his Navy reports, which were updated several times through the 1970s. The version that I have is the 1972 version, which has over 2,400 citations, each identifying adverse health effects of this non-ionizing radiofrequency radiation, with whole chapters devoted to each of a number of symptoms reported in diplomats. There's the 1976 Defense Intelligence Agency report, 1981 NASA report, 1988 Air Force report, and that one, which, by the way, has a title that begins with radiofrequency microwave radiation biological effects, that includes the quote, experimental evidence has shown that exposure to low-intensity radiation can have a profound effect on biological processes. And remember, this is a report about radiofrequency microwave radiation. And again, to underscore, it notes that experimental evidence has shown that exposure to low-intensity radiation can have a profound effect on biological processes. So how then is it possible that there is such controversy, both about whether this could be responsible in diplomats and about whether it could be responsible for health problems in the civilian sector? After all, the evidence of a mechanism involving oxidative stress is highly replicated and powerfully triangulated, and there's evidence of involvement of a number of downstream mechanisms that are known to be caused by oxidative stress, and triangulating evidence showing that affected persons are more likely to have genes that are adverse to oxidative stress defense, et cetera. And we know that oxidative stress contributes to many of these health problems. Also, there are the specific data in diplomats regarding the noises and the symptoms. So how then is there such controversy? Well, one mechanism or reason is a financial conflict of interest with a highly lucrative set of products. It's essentially a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And I was perhaps the first to document the many different ways in which financial conflict of interest can distort medical science. But this has been looked at specifically in the issue of radiofrequency radiation, among others by Huss, who's found that studies that were fully funded by industry had about 1/10 the odds, 0.11, of showing health effects relative to studies that were funded purely by government or charity. The potential impact of conflict of interest on scientific results, I think, is underscored by the following quote from Richard Smith, former editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, or BMJ, in response to findings that conflict of interest were the main explanatory finding for differences in results in a different field. Quote, far from conflict of interest being unimportant in the objective and pure world of science, where method and the quality of data is everything, it is the main factor determining the results of studies. So again, Richard Smith's conclusion from this evidence was that far from conflict of interest being unimportant in what should be an objective and pure world of science that should depend just on method and the quality of data, in fact, it can be the main factor determining study results. Next source of controversy comes from the observation, which is quite correct, that regulatory and advisory groups say there isn't a problem and can't be a problem. But regulatory and advisory groups do not represent in any way scientific consensus. Not that scientific consensus necessarily is the arbiter of truth either. But membership on regulatory and advisory committees is influenced by political and financial pressures. And indeed, multiple articles and reports have been written on the conflict of interest endemic in such advisory groups, such as Norm Alster's report from the Harvard Staff for Ethics Center entitled Captured Agency. The third source of controversy stems from so-called provocation studies, in which individuals with purported electrosensitivity are exposed to radiation in, quote, double-blind settings. And it is ascertained from this that, guess what? They can't reliably tell when they're being exposed and when they're not. But so what? We don't require that for any other toxin that produces adverse effects. The assumption that people should be able to tell when they're being exposed and when they're not ignores the evidence that there are variable mechanisms involved with variable time courses to onset and recovery. The body is not a meter and should not be expected to operate as one. Indeed, an analogy, more than an analogy, a homology can be adduced from the issue of sunburn, which is also radiation-induced injury, as from ultraviolet light, which can include ionizing parts of the spectrum, but in fact, sunburn is produced not by ionization, but by oxidative stress and its downstream mechanism of inflammation. Just as with non-ionizing radiation injury otherwise, people vary widely in whether a given exposure will cause a problem or not, based in part on genetic factors and based in part on exposures around the time of involvement. The same person won't necessarily have the same effect from time to time because they can have adaptive upregulation of antioxidant defenses, including incidentally melanin, which has antioxidant properties. But their ability to do that varies from person to person, and some people will already be maximally upregulated. They can't get more than a certain degree of tan, for example. People can't reliably tell when they're being exposed, and they can't reliably tell when the exposure ceases. The first symptoms of sunburn may arise after the ultraviolet exposure has gone away. Nonetheless, despite this, people justly infer that it is the sun that has caused their problems. Another source of controversy stems from purported inconsistency in findings, and some of this inconsistency arises from host differences. We referred to the effect modification that arises from in association with this oxidative preconditioning phenomenon, which is also, again, called hormesis in the setting of radiation. And so different individuals may upregulate or downregulate antioxidant defenses with variable effects on downstream mechanisms. And also there's variability in, induction of oxidative stress and from oxidative stress to downstream mechanisms. But on top of that, there are differences in other aspects of study methodology, and where methods differ, results should be expected to differ as well. An example of the impact of exposure statistics comes in the following quote from Panagopoulos. While experimental studies employing simulated EMF emissions present a strong inconsistency among the results, with less than 50% of them reporting effects, studies employing real mobile phone exposures demonstrate an almost 100% consistency in showing adverse effects. So real mobile phone exposures encompass a variety of features that is endemic to real radiation, such as polarization for anthropogenic, man-made, sources of communications radiation, polarization, multiple frequencies, and pulsation and modulation, which all magnify the biological effect. Now, of course, having said that they show an almost 100% consistency, it would be very easy for industry to design studies that don't show an effect. Essentially, this is throwing down the gauntlet. It's very easy to design a study to show a negative effect. So another source of controversy comes from, or I guess other sources of controversy can be distilled to the term PR, or public relations. And they're the so-called 4 Ds of PR: deny, delay, dismiss, and discredit. And examples of the first 3 of these Ds can be seen including in articles from sources like IEEE magazines that should be expected to be better. But typical examples include RF is non-ionizing radiation. It's not the kind of radiation that could damage DNA and cause cancer. But in fact, although it is non-ionizing radiation, it is absolutely the kind of radiation that can damage DNA and can cause cancer. In fact, Henry Lai back in the 1990s showed that radiofrequency radiation can cause both single and double-stranded DNA breaks. And there's data showing that melatonin can protect against DNA damage with radiofrequency radiation. Hardell and Karlberg's work show that radiofrequency radiation from cell phones meets Hill's criteria for causality and induction of glioblastoma. Or another quote would be, for RF, there's no known plausible biophysical mechanism of action for harm. Well, this is a commonly repeated mantra. It just happens to be completely untrue. As you saw, evidence that oxidative stress is not only a plausible but heavily documented mechanism of action for harm is both heavily replicated and powerfully triangulated. Or the claim that the weight of the evidence shows no risk. In fact, for those that collate the weight of the evidence, the majority of studies that examine whether those risks do find there's risk, and if this is segregated according to whether or not industry funded the research, then the predominance of studies showing harm versus not becomes even more striking. The 4th D is discredit, those who raise concerns about problems, and discrediting efforts are well recognized for people who raise concerns about harms from lucrative products, and they involve kind of a stereotyped lingo that I refer to as the takedown lexicon that often involves claims like conspiracy, fringe, nutcase, pseudoscience, junk science, low-quality studies, function on circumventing alleged scientific consensus, which in fact there is no such scientific consensus, scaremongering, fear-mongering, etc. So both diplomats' health problems and those who experience health problems from non-ionizing radiation in the civilian sector have been exposed to claims that these problems are psychogenic, that they're all in their head. Mass hysteria is the term that has been particularly used for the diplomats, and the nocebo effect prominently used for those with electrosensitivity. The idea of psychogenic illness has its origins in Freud, and while much of the rest of Freud's ideas have been successfully discredited over the ages, somehow it seems that nobody ever bothered to formally discredit the idea of psychogenic illness. But in fact, there has never been any established foundation for the idea of psychogenic illness. There is no known mechanism by which it would operate, much less a mechanism for testing whether such mechanism is, much less an approach for testing whether such mechanism would be operating. By explaining virtually everything, it functions to explain nothing. There's a massive standard of evidence disparity in those who allege psychogenic illness. Their idea seems to be that for any organic, that is to say physiological cause, absence of proof of causation constitutes proof of absence of causation, whereas for psychogenic explanations, suggestion equals proof by fiat. In fact, this often involves circular reasoning that is not falsifiable and resists contrary evidence. Indeed, the most recent version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatry has actually changed requirements so that now even if you find an organic cause, it no longer negates the claim that a problem is psychogenic. So essentially, whoever leveled the label can never be proved wrong. More in-depth evaluation often finds a cause, and historically, conditions that were thought to often or typically be psychogenic, that this has proved to be wrong with more in-depth analysis. For example, until comparatively recently, ulcers were thought to be induced by stress, but in fact, it is now recognized that over 95% can be ascribed to either Helicobacter pylori infection or nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And I'm going to skip to item number 7 here. It is not just the case that psychogenic explanations are wrong-headed and lacking in a foundation in scientific evidence and not deployed in a fashion that is even meaningful, but on top of that, they're frankly damaging. They are victim blaming, they prejudice care, they prevent the search for the actual cause. One example is a hantavirus case that was in the news last year where a woman was repeatedly turned out of a hospital for her complaints that were thought to be in her head or malingering. And by the way, those two ideas are often used together until she ultimately required ventilator support and then died of her hantavirus disease. Or a case that was cited by a Gulf War veteran in a survey we conducted, giving an analogy to how they felt when their Gulf War illness was ascribed to psychogenic causes, and giving the example of their mother. They stated, doctors kept telling my mother that her migraines, headaches, walking into walls, and finally going blind was in her head. She died after surgery to remove a grapefruit-sized brain tumor. So again, these psychogenic designations are not only scientifically vacuous, that they are potentially extremely damaging. So also illustrative that this is not a nocebo fact, as is the term that is frequently applied and is used by the World Health Organization for those who are electrosensitive. In a survey that we conducted of a little over 200 people with electrosensitivity, we asked at the onset of the first symptoms now attributed to electromagnetic radiation, were you aware that others had similar problems with EMR? And over 70% of participants said no. And even among the 28% that said yes, we received comments like the following. I knew someone who claimed to be sensitive to EMR, but I thought she was nuts. But I almost thought they were just being overly concerned until I experienced it for myself. But I did not believe that it was real, thought it was psychosomatic. So the people can't have been suggested into these problems. Most of them had never heard that these problems could occur. And for a number of those who had heard, they simply didn't believe them. So what are the alternative hypotheses that have been tendered for diplomats' health problems? We have psychogenic, the most recently covered one, more or less in the middle of this slide, RF on the left. Other hypotheses include a sonic hypothesis, stress, chemical, particularly pesticides, and viral. But if we look at their specific fit, for example, to the 6 specific features of the noises heard, the quantitative as well as qualitative profile of symptoms reported, the objective signs, the precedent for use in diplomats in past foreign embassy settings, and a biological mechanism that can account for both the noises and the symptoms, we see that these are each a fit for RF microwave, but only are a fit for these. Certainly sonic hypotheses could account for the occurrence of noises, but the noises do not fit the 6 specific characteristics. Certainly chemicals like pesticides could account for symptoms, but not in the quantitative profile that was produced. So this is really the only hypothesis that accounts for each of these critical features, and this is a specific fit to each of them, and it is a fit to all of them. So essentially this, again, compels the conclusion that pulse radiofrequency microwave radiation is the cause of these health problems. Now to move on to our take-home messages. First, in terms of symptoms experienced by diplomats, the most common problems are sleep problems, cognitive problems, and headache. But other problems are myriad and encompass tinnitus, hearing loss, nosebleed, dizziness, nausea, anxiety, irritability, vision problems, and many others. Imaging is reported to look like traumatic brain injury, both for diplomats and for those with non-ionizing radiation sensitivity in the civilian sector. The time course is such that withdrawal of radiofrequency radiation leads to variable recovery, and this has been true in the diplomats have had variable recovery. And continued exposure to radiofrequency radiation at the level that caused problems leads to variable progression. The noises that were reported by diplomats fit the phenomenon known as the Frey effect or microwave auditory effect, which requires low ambient noise, and indeed sounds were heard only in settings of low ambient noise. Perceived sounds differ based on head dimensions and differed from diplomat to diplomat. They encompass the stereotype spectrum of potential sounds like chirping, clicking, clanging, buzzing, hissing, grinding, and these are the sounds that were reported by diplomats. They can seem to follow people if they move within a territory in which the sound is heard, as was reported. They can be tightly spatially localized and abruptly disappear with movement out of a given territory and abruptly return with movement back into it, as was reported. Covering the ears produces no reduction in intensity, as was also reported for diplomats. So again, these 6 features which look like 5 here because I split one into 2, are each expectations or predictions of radio frequency. None are expectations or predictions of sound waves, and some are incompatible with it. The source of radiation and here we rely on conjecture, is most likely to be surveillance or weaponry in the diplomat setting. Innocent intended communication sources like radar, cell towers, Wi-Fi, smart meters, etc., are the primary source. There's precedent for exposure to microwaves by past U.S. Foreign Services personnel at the embassy in Moscow from 1953 to the 1980s or 1990s. Mechanisms are well documented, including oxidative stress, for which there's strong replication and powerful triangulation, as well as downstream mechanisms, which encompass, among others, inflammation, induction of autoantibodies, adverse effects on membranes, triggering of apoptosis or programmed cell death, adverse effects on mitochondria, changes in voltage-gated ion channels, and blood-brain barrier impairments. Pulsed radiofrequency radiation is overwhelmingly the best supported hypothesis for diplomats' health problems. Indeed, evidence of radiofrequency-induced problems of a compatible nature is longstanding and comes from credible sources, including multiple U.S. government reports. Indeed, the basis of debate is substantially manufactured based on financial conflicts of interest, which distort the dialogue. Thank you so much for your kind attention.